They never bought me a single gift. Not for my birthday, not for Christmas, not even when I graduated at the top of my class. But my sister, she just got a house. Damn. Oh, so I made sure they paid for it in the end. You'd think I'd be used to it by now. That maybe after 35 years, I'd have grown numb to the way my parents always saw Emily as the delicate little flower and me as the weed that just refused to die. But the truth is, it still stung, even after all these years. No matter how much I told myself I didn't care, some part of me had always held on to the hope that one day, they'd see me, really see me, and realize how unfair they had been. But that day never came. Instead, I got a phone call. "Guess what, Meg?" My mother's voice crackled through the receiver, the same overly sweet tone she always used when she was about to rub something in my face. "Your father and I just surprised Emily with a house. Isn't that exciting?" I felt my fingers tighten around my phone, nails digging into my palm. My stomach twisted, not with jealousy but with something much darker. A slow, simmering anger that had been building for years, one that I had learned to swallow down like bitter medicine. But this was the final straw. "A house," I repeated, forcing my voice to stay level, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. "You bought Emily a house. Oh, it was such a good deal, we just couldn't pass it up," my mother chirped, oblivious to the way my entire body had gone rigid. 3 bedrooms, a big backyard, and the best part, she doesn't have to pay a single cent. We took care of everything. Like they had never done for me. I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply as a flood of memories surged forward. Memories I had long tried to bury. Christmas mornings where Emily unwrapped mountains of presents while I sat there pretending not to care. Birthdays where she got extravagant parties, new dresses, expensive jewelry, while I got a hurried happy birthday, and maybe if they remembered, a $10 bill shoved into a card. College tuition paid in full for Emily while I worked 3 jobs and took out crushing loans just to afford community college. Every damn time I needed help, they had an excuse. "You're the strong one, Megan," my father would say. His voice full of that condescending warmth I had grown to despise. "Emily's different. She needs more from us." And now they had given her a house. I opened my eyes and exhaled, slow and steady, letting the rage settle into something colder, something more useful. "That's great, Mom," I said finally, my voice smooth, calculated. "She must be so happy." "Oh, she cried when we gave her the keys," my mother gushed, laughing like it was the sweetest thing in the world. She just kept saying, "I don't deserve this."
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
But of course she does, doesn't she? She's been through so much. I gritted my teeth. Emily had been through so much. Emily, who had never had to struggle for a single thing in her entire life. Emily, who had always had everything handed to her while I was left to fend for myself. "Oh, I almost forgot," my mother added breezily. "We're throwing a little housewarming party next weekend. You'll come, won't you? It would mean so much to Emily." I smiled, though my mother couldn't see it. A slow, deliberate smile that stretched across my face as an idea took root in my mind. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world," I murmured. "Because if they wanted to play favorites, then fine. Let's play." The night after my mother's call, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of decades pressing down on me, crushing the breath from my lungs. My mind, unable to quiet itself, dragged me back through the years, forcing me to relive every moment that had led to this. The neglect, the favoritism, the unshakable certainty that, no matter what I did, I would never be enough for them. It wasn't just about the house, though that was the final insult, the last slap in the face that finally shattered whatever fragile illusions I had left. It was everything. A lifetime of being the afterthought, the inconvenience, the daughter they had never wanted but tolerated because they had no choice. I could still remember the day I found out they had paid for Emily's tuition in full, writing a check so effortlessly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to do for their child. I had been in my 3rd year of college at the time, working 2 jobs just to scrape by, surviving on cheap ramen and black coffee, drowning in student loan debt because they had told me again and again that they just couldn't afford to help me. "We wish we could, sweetheart," my mother had said, shaking her head in that insincere way she always did when she was lying. "But money's just too tight right now." So I hadn't questioned it. Not until I overheard a conversation between my father and an uncle at a family gathering. My father had been bragging, laughing about how lucky Emily was that she'd never have to worry about student loans. how he and my mother had made sure she would graduate debt-free. My stomach had dropped so hard I thought I might throw up right there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by relatives who had always pretended not to notice the way I was treated differently. When I confronted them later that night, my voice shaking with barely contained fury, my father had only sighed as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over something trivial. "Emily needs support, Megan," he had said, his tone patient in that way that only made me angrier. "You're independent, strong. You'll be fine." And that was always their excuse, wasn't it? They had built this narrative in their minds where Emily was the fragile, helpless one, incapable of standing on her own 2 feet, while I was the one who could take care of herself. And because they believed it, they had used it to justify every act of neglect, every unfair decision, every time they had chosen her over me. It wasn't just the tuition. It was the birthday gifts I never got while Emily's room was always overflowing with presents. It was the way she was given a brand new car for her 16th birthday while I had to buy my own with money I had saved from working part-time jobs. It was the vacations they took her on while I was told they couldn't afford to bring me along. It was the way they always seemed to have an excuse, a reason, a justification for why she deserved more. I had spent years convincing myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need their help, that I was better off standing on my own 2 feet anyway. I had told myself that being independent was a blessing, that it made me stronger, that I would never be as weak as Emily. But now, as I sat there in my dark apartment, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, I realized the truth. I had never wanted their money. I had never wanted their gifts. I had only ever wanted to matter. The next morning I drove past our old house, the one I had grown up in, the one that had never felt like home. It had been sold years ago, after Emily moved out and my parents decided they didn't need such a big place anymore. They hadn't even told me about it until after the sale was finalized. I had found out through a casual remark from an aunt at a family gathering, a passing comment that had made my chest tighten with something I hadn't wanted to name. I parked across the street, staring at the house that had been mine once, at least in theory. Someone else lived there now, their car in the driveway, their children's toys scattered across the front lawn. I wondered if they were happy there, if they felt the warmth that I had never felt within those walls. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my nails biting into my palm. They hadn't even cared where I lived. But I was going to make sure they cared now. I sat in my small apartment, the glow of my laptop screen casting sharp shadows across the dimly lit room, my fingers tapping idly against the edge of my desk as I stared at the bank statements I had pulled up on my screen. My parents had always claimed they struggled financially, always making excuses when I had asked for even the smallest bit of help, yet somehow they had managed to buy Emily an entire house without blinking. That alone had made me suspicious, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about their finances. My parents had always been secretive when it came to money, but if they had been lying to me for years, I had to wonder, what else were they hiding? I wasn't even sure what I was looking for at first, but I knew there had to be something. People who spent their lives making excuses and manipulating situations the way my parents did always left a trail of secrets behind them, and all I had to do was find it. I started small, running their names through property records, searching for any assets they might have hidden. I expected to find the house they had just bought for Emily, maybe some old mortgage records from when they had owned our childhood home, but what I didn't expect to find was an entire second property listed under my father's name. It wasn't in our hometown, not even in the same state. It was some small condo in Florida, something that had been purchased years ago, long before they had told me they were struggling and barely getting by. I felt my stomach twist as I clicked through the records, scanning through tax payments and legal documents, piecing together a story that had been kept from me for far too long. They had never been struggling. They had never been unable to help me. They had simply chosen not to. They had lied to my face while funding a second life somewhere else, while ensuring Emily never had to lift a single finger to support herself. The injustice of it all burned deep, igniting something inside me that had been simmering for years but had never had an outlet. But now I had leverage. I wasn't naive enough to think I could confront them directly. My parents had spent their entire lives crafting lies and twisting the truth to make themselves look like the victims, and I knew that if I tried to call them out, they would only gaslight me, make me feel like I was the one who was overreacting. No, I needed to play this carefully. I needed to chip away at the perfect little world they had built for themselves, the one where Emily was untouchable and I was nothing more than an afterthought. And that's when I thought of Emily. If there was one person who had never had to struggle, who had never had to face a single consequence in her life, it was her. She had coasted through everything. shielded from the real world by the endless safety net our parents had built around her. But people like Emily, people who had never truly suffered, were weak in ways they never realized. They were careless, entitled, convinced that nothing could ever touch them. And that made them vulnerable. I knew Emily well enough to know that she was careless with her passwords. She had always used variations of the same thing, something simple and predictable. And when I tried logging into her email using an old childhood nickname she had once used for everything, I wasn't surprised when it worked. It was almost laughable how easy it was. Scrolling through her inbox, I expected to find the usual nonsense. Shopping receipts, social media notifications, maybe some boring work emails. But then I saw something that made me pause, my pulse quickening as I clicked on a thread buried beneath all the clutter. The subject line was short. Last Saturday was amazing. My fingers tightened around the mouse as I opened it, my eyes scanning over the messages inside. And there it was, proof laid out in black and white. Emily's boyfriend, the man she had been flaunting at every family gathering, the one our parents had adored, had been cheating on her. And not just with anyone. He had been sleeping with a married woman, someone who, according to their messages, had no intention of leaving her husband. Emily didn't know. She had no clue that the man she trusted was lying to her, that he was sneaking around behind her back, and the thought of it filled me with something I couldn't quite name. Was it satisfaction? Justice? Maybe it was just the simple pleasure of knowing that, for once, Emily's perfect little life was about to crack. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen for a long moment before finally reaching for my phone. I knew what I had to do. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second before I typed out a single message. Ask your girlfriend what she did last Saturday. No name. No explanation. Just enough to plant the seed of doubt. I hit send. Then I sat back and smiled. The fallout didn't happen immediately, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the message I had sent worked its way into Emily's perfect little world and started to rot it from the inside. People like Emily, who had been coddled and protected their entire lives, didn't know how to handle suspicion, how to live in uncertainty, how to sit with the kind of anxiety that came from not knowing who to trust. I knew she would confront him. I knew she would demand answers. And I knew, no matter how well he tried to lie, doubt had already been planted deep inside her mind. It was 3 days before I got my first confirmation that the cracks had started to form. I was sitting at my desk at work, pretending to focus on a spreadsheet I had no real interest in, when my phone vibrated with a text from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months. Holy shit, did you hear about Emily and Jake? I didn't respond right away, didn't want to seem too eager, but my pulse quickened as I typed out a casual, "No, what happened?" It took less than a minute for the response to come through. Apparently, he broke off the engagement. Something about trust issues. Emily is a mess. I sat back in my chair, staring at the words for a long moment, letting them settle in, letting them warm me from the inside out. This was exactly what I had wanted. A small, precise strike that sent her perfect life spiraling without anyone ever suspecting I had been the one to put the wheels in motion. By that evening, the news had spread through the family like wildfire. Everyone had an opinion. Some thought Jake was an idiot for throwing away such a perfect relationship. Others, mostly the older women in the family who had always doted on Emily, were convinced he must have cheated and that Emily was the poor, innocent victim of some cruel betrayal. My parents, unsurprisingly, fell into the second camp, treating the entire thing like some devastating tragedy that had shattered their entire world. I wasn't surprised when my mother called me that night. Her voice tight with controlled fury, the kind she only ever used when she was looking for someone to blame. "Megan, please tell me you had nothing to do with this," she demanded before I even had a chance to say hello. Her words sharp enough to cut. I blinked slowly, letting a carefully crafted hurt seep into my voice as I answered. "What are you talking about?" My mother let out a sharp breath, the kind she always exhaled when she thought I was being deliberately difficult. "Emily is devastated, Megan. Jake left her, and now she's saying she doesn't even know who sent that message. But I swear if I find out it was you." I let out a soft, wounded breath, interrupting her before she could finish whatever threat she had been about to throw at me. "Mom, why would you even think that?" I asked, my voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "Why would I want to hurt Emily? I know you think I'm jealous of her or whatever, but I just want to be part of the family. I just want to be included." It was the perfect lie, one that twisted just enough truth into it to make it sound painfully real. I had spent so many years pretending I didn't care about being left out, pretending I was above it, but the reality was, a part of me had always wanted to belong, had always wanted them to treat me like I mattered. And now, for the first time, I was using that against them. My mother hesitated, the anger in her voice faltering slightly. Megan, I didn't mean. But she had. She always had. And even now, even when she knew how cruel it sounded, she still didn't have it in her to take it back. I forced out a shaky breath, keeping my voice soft, broken, just enough to make her squirm. You've always thought the worst of me, haven't you? I whispered. No matter what I do, I'm always the bad guy. Emily gets a house, Emily gets love, Emily gets everything, and I'm just the jealous, bitter sister who can't be trusted. There was silence on the other end of the line. I had struck a nerve. But I have to go, I murmured before she could recover enough to say anything else. Then I hung up and sat there in the quiet of my apartment, staring down at my phone, feeling something shift inside me, something cold and weightless and free. Later that night I went digging again, not through emails this time, but through something even more valuable. My parents had always been the type to talk freely when they thought no one was listening, and over the years, I had learned exactly how to use that to my advantage. I had left an old phone hidden in their living room months ago, a device so small and forgotten that they never even noticed it, tucked away behind a stack of decorative books on a shelf no one ever touched. It had been recording on and off for weeks, capturing fragments of conversations, bits and pieces of things I had never really cared about until now. I scrolled through the recordings, fast-forwarding through mindless chatter, through complaints about traffic and grocery prices, through the mundane, useless details of their day-to-day lives, until I found something that made my breath hitch in my throat. A conversation, quiet, hushed, like they were afraid of being overheard. My mother's voice tense. You know we never wanted two, George. One was enough, but then Megan happened, and what were we supposed to do? My father sighing. I know. But it's not like we could have gotten rid of her. Silence. Then my mother again, softer this time. Sometimes I think about how different things would have been if it had just been Emily. If we didn't have to worry about Megan. If we didn't have to pretend. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, listening to those words over and over again, letting them carve themselves into me, let them sink deep into my bones until I felt nothing at all. They had never wanted me. I had always known it. But hearing it in their own voices, was something else entirely. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I sat in my car outside my apartment complex, gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my mind replaying the conversation over and over again until the words became nothing more than a dull, numbing hum in the back of my skull. They had never wanted me. They had pretended for my entire life. Every fake smile, every half-hearted attempt at affection, every excuse they had ever given me. It had all been a performance, an obligation, a role they had played because they had no other choice. But now they had no idea that their words had been captured forever, recorded in a way that made it impossible to deny, impossible to twist, impossible to manipulate into something that absolved them of guilt. And as I sat there, staring blankly at my screen, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I could have confronted them. I could have marched into their house and forced them to look me in the eye and say those words again, made them own the truth they had been hiding for decades. But I knew them too well, knew exactly how they would react. They would twist it, manipulate it, gaslight me until I doubted my own memory, until I started questioning whether I had really heard what I thought I had heard. No, they didn't deserve a quiet confrontation. They didn't deserve the dignity of handling this in private. They deserved to have their entire world shattered the way they had shattered mine. It didn't take much effort to send the recording out. I started small, forwarding it to a few cousins I knew would waste no time in spreading it like wildfire, adding nothing more than a short, simple message. Thought you should know the truth. Then I sent it to an aunt who had always looked down on me, a woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I should be grateful for what I had, that I was lucky to have parents like mine. I sent it to my mother's two closest friends, women who had spent years gossiping about everyone else's family drama but had always acted as though my parents were above all of that. And then I sat back and waited. It took less than an hour before my phone started blowing up with notifications, messages pouring in from relatives who suddenly had a lot to say. Some were shocked, horrified that my parents had spoken about me that way, that they had spent years treating me like an unwanted burden while pretending to be a picture-perfect family. Others were angry, furious that my mother and father had spent years lying about our family dynamic, pretending that I was the difficult one, the jealous one, the problem. But the best part was that no one was defending them. I knew my parents would hear about it before the day was over. And I was right. At exactly 7:30 that evening, my phone rang, my mother's name flashing across the screen, and for the first time in my life, I let it go to voicemail. Less than a minute later my father called, and when I ignored that too, I received the first in a string of frantic, furious text messages demanding that I call them back immediately. But I didn't. I let them panic, let them stew in the mess they had made, let them feel powerless in a way they had never felt before. By the time I finally picked up, just after midnight, I could hear the barely contained hysteria in my mother's voice, the breathless, desperate panic of a woman whose carefully constructed world had started crumbling beneath her feet. "Megan," she breathed, her voice sharp and trembling, as though she had spent the entire evening sobbing. "What did you do?" I leaned back against my pillows, my fingers toying with the edge of my blanket, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face as I imagined her sitting there in her pristine, over-decorated living room, clutching her phone with shaking hands, finally understanding what it felt like to have everything taken from you without warning. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my tone light, almost amused, as though this entire situation was nothing more than some minor misunderstanding. "Don't play games with me," she snapped, her voice rising in frustration, the carefully controlled facade she had spent decades perfecting beginning to crack. "Do you have any idea what you've done? People are calling us, texting us, demanding explanations. Your aunt called me crying. Your uncle told your father he was disgusting. Our entire reputation is ruined because of you." I let the silence stretch between us for a moment before I spoke again, my voice calm, measured, completely devoid of the emotion she was expecting. "No, Mom," I murmured, my fingers tapping idly against the side of my phone. "Your reputation is ruined because of you. I just gave people the truth they deserved to hear." She let out a choked, furious sound, something between a sob and a growl, and then the line went dead. I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes, letting the weight of everything settle over me, the cold, sweet satisfaction of knowing that, for the first time in my life, I had taken something from them instead of the other way around. But I wasn't done yet. Because while my parents were busy putting out fires, Emily was about to walk into a problem she had no idea was coming. I had done some digging, more digging than before, and what I had found had made my breath catch in my throat, had sent a thrill of dark, quiet anticipation running through me. The house, the one my parents had gifted her so generously, the one she had paraded around as proof of just how much she was loved, wasn't fully paid off. My parents had lied to her the same way they had lied to me, had stretched themselves thin to make it happen, had put themselves in a financial position they couldn't afford just to ensure their golden child never had to struggle. And that meant there were weaknesses, loopholes, opportunities. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had spent years handling my own finances, navigating the mess of student loans and credit card debt without a single ounce of help from my family, and I knew how to find cracks in paperwork, knew how to look for the tiny details that other people overlooked. And this was the best discovery yet. Because if I played my cards right, I wasn't just going to ruin their reputation. I was going to take Emily's house right out from under her. I smirked, rolling onto my side, letting my eyes drift shut as I whispered to myself, "Time to play with the paperwork." The morning after my parents' world began unraveling, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years, stretching my limbs beneath the blankets as sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting golden lines across the floor of my small but comfortable apartment. The fallout from the leaked recording had already begun, and I knew my parents were scrambling to control the damage, their carefully crafted reputations crumbling as relatives whispered, as old friends distanced themselves, as the truth of who they really were spread through the family like a virus. But that wasn't enough for me. Ruining their image was satisfying, yes, but it wasn't the kind of justice I had spent my entire life craving. Because for years they had not only dismissed me, not only neglected me, but they had actively worked to ensure that Emily never knew a single day of hardship, while I had been forced to scrape by, struggling for every dollar, every opportunity, every ounce of security they had denied me. I had worked my fingers to the bone while they had built an empire of lies, pretending to be struggling, pretending to have no means to help me, all while they funneled money into Emily's dreams, her education, her entire future, as if I didn't even exist. But now, for the first time, they were the ones who were powerless. I sat at my desk, sipping coffee as I opened my laptop, my fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as I began digging into their finances once again. I had already found evidence of their second property, the little condo they had kept hidden, the one they had quietly maintained while telling me they were barely keeping their heads above water. But if they had been lying about that, I had to wonder, what else were they hiding? It didn't take long to find out. People like my parents, people who thrived on deception, who built their lives on secrets and manipulation, always made mistakes, always left trails of evidence for those who knew where to look. And as I combed through records, traced payments, and cross-checked tax filings, I began to notice the discrepancies, the inconsistencies that told a story they had tried to keep buried. There were unreported assets. There were unexplained transfers. There were years of financial maneuvering that didn't quite add up, transactions that looked innocent on the surface but, when examined closely, told a different story entirely. They had been hiding money, shielding it from the IRS, keeping certain assets off the books to avoid taxes, all while maintaining the illusion that they were just another struggling middle-class couple trying to do right by their children. Except they hadn't done right by me. And now, I had the power to do something about it. I leaned back in my chair, my heart hammering steadily in my chest as I pulled up the IRS's anonymous tip submission page, my fingers hovering over the keyboard for only a moment before I began typing, carefully detailing everything I had found, ensuring that every piece of information I provided was accurate, irrefutable, impossible to ignore. I wasn't sloppy. I wasn't reckless. I knew how these things worked, and I knew that if I wanted real consequences, I had to make sure my report wasn't just a baseless accusation, but a damning case that they wouldn't be able to explain away. By the time I clicked submit, I felt no remorse, no hesitation, no second thoughts. Because my parents had spent their lives making me feel like I was nothing, and now I was about to make sure they knew exactly what that felt like. The first sign that my plan had worked came in the form of a panicked voicemail from my mother. Her voice trembling, breathless, barely controlled as she tried, and failed, to keep the fear out of her tone. "Megan, I need you to call me immediately," she said, the false warmth that usually coated her words completely stripped away. "We just got a letter from the IRS. There's been some kind of mistake, some kind of misunderstanding, and we need to figure out what's going on. This is serious, Megan, please, just call me back." I didn't. Instead, I waited, watching as the situation escalated, as my parents' panic turned to full-blown desperation, as they scrambled to make sense of the investigation that had suddenly upended their lives. My father, always the composed one, was cracking under the pressure, calling relatives, calling lawyers, calling anyone who might be able to make this go away. My mother was slipping into hysteria, her carefully controlled world crashing down around her, the weight of their actions finally coming back to haunt her in ways she had never imagined possible. And Emily was furious. Because as the audit deepened, as the reality of their financial situation came to light, it became clear that the house they had given her, the perfect, beautiful gift that had once been the crown jewel of their favoritism, was now at risk. If the IRS determined that the house had been purchased with undeclared funds, if they found any evidence that my parents had tried to hide money through real estate transactions, then it wasn't just their bank accounts that would be frozen. It was Emily's home that would be on the line. And for the first time in her life, my sister was finally learning what it felt like to lose something. I heard through the family grapevine that Emily had gone to our parents in tears, demanding answers, demanding solutions, demanding to know how they could have let this happen. But there were no answers that could fix this. No easy solutions that could undo the damage I had inflicted. Because they had spent their lives believing they were untouchable. And now they were finally paying the price. That night, as I sat in my apartment pouring myself a generous glass of wine, I allowed myself to savor the moment, to drink in the satisfaction of knowing that, for the first time, they were the ones struggling, they were the ones grasping at straws, they were the ones who had everything to lose. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the deep red liquid catch the light, a slow smile curling at the edges of my lips as I whispered into the empty room, the words tasting like victory on my tongue. "Now you know how it feels to have nothing." The first call came early in the morning, my phone vibrating against my nightstand with a desperate urgency that told me, before I even looked at the screen, exactly who it was. I let it ring. Then I let it ring again. And again. Each call a frantic attempt to reach me. Each voicemail a plea laced with growing panic. Each message proof that, for the first time in their lives, my parents had nowhere else to turn. By the time noon rolled around, my phone had accumulated a dozen missed calls and just as many text messages, each one more frantic than the last. But I didn't answer, not yet. I wanted them to sweat, to feel the weight of their own helplessness pressing down on them, to know what it felt like to be ignored, to be unimportant, to be the afterthought in someone else's world. When I finally did pick up, it wasn't because I felt mercy. It wasn't because I was curious about what they had to say. It was because I wanted to hear them beg. "Megan, thank God," my mother's voice cracked as soon as I answered, her usual cold composure completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate kind of fear that made my stomach tighten with something close to satisfaction. "We need to talk, sweetheart. Your father and I, things have gotten out of control and we just need to fix this, okay? We're family, Megan. No matter what's happened, we are still family. I let the silence stretch between us, let her words hang there, suffocating in the weight of their own hypocrisy. Family. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, hollow and meaningless, a concept they had only ever used when it was convenient for them. Now, when everything was crumbling, when they were drowning in the consequences of their own actions, now they wanted to be a family. Now they wanted to fix things. I exhaled slowly, tilting my head as I let my voice slip into something calm, something dangerous, something that sent a shiver of warning down my mother's spine even before I spoke. You want to fix this? I murmured, tapping my fingers against the armrest of my chair. Tell me, Mom, where was this energy when I needed help? Where was this desperation to make things right when I was drowning in student loan debt? When I was working 3 jobs just to keep myself afloat while you were busy buying Emily a house? Megan, please, she whispered, her voice breaking in a way I had never heard before. We didn't mean, things weren't supposed to happen like this. I laughed, sharp and humorless, my grip tightening around my phone as something inside me, something deep and unforgiving, finally snapped. Like what, Mom? Like me finding out that I was an accident. Like me realizing that you and Dad never wanted me. Like me finally understanding that I have been nothing to you my entire life. There was a beat of silence. Then another. And then my father's voice cut through, low and gruff, laced with exhaustion and something dangerously close to defeat. We made mistakes, Megan, he admitted. His voice stripped of its usual authority, its usual self-righteousness. But we are still your parents, and you. No, I interrupted, my tone sharper than I had intended, but I didn't care. You were never my parents. You were Emily's parents. I was just the consequence of something you didn't plan for. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I almost thought they had hung up. But then I heard a muffled sound, a sharp, frustrated breath, and then Emily's voice, cutting through like a blade, thick with rage and accusation. God, Megan, are you really this bitter? She snapped, her usual sweet, pampered tone gone, replaced by something raw, something vicious, something that reminded me that, beneath all of her golden child perfection, she had always known how much easier her life had been. I get it, okay? You feel left out. You feel like Mom and Dad didn't do enough for you, but you know what? Maybe if you weren't so difficult all the time, they would have treated you differently. I laughed, full and unrestrained, a sound that sent ice crawling up Emily's spine, because she knew, that this wasn't just bitterness. This was something far worse. Oh, sweetie, I murmured, my voice dripping with amusement. I'm just getting started. And then I hung up. I could almost imagine Emily's face, red with anger, her hands trembling as she turned to our parents for reassurance, only to realize that, for the first time in her life, they couldn't fix this for her. But I wasn't finished yet. Because I had been doing more than just exposing their secrets. I had been planning ahead. And as I pulled up the latest financial reports, scrolling through the legal documents I had spent the last few days collecting, I felt something dark and triumphant settle in my chest. Emily's house, the one my parents had bought for her so generously, was still technically in their names. The mortgage had never been fully paid off, which meant that, legally, there were loopholes I could exploit. And I intended to exploit them. I made a call, my voice steady, my words crisp, my intentions clear. And by the end of the conversation it was done. I had just bought out the mortgage on Emily's house. It was mine now. Every brick. Every floorboard. Every inch of it. I leaned back, exhaling slowly as I let the weight of what I had done sink in. Let the realization settle over me like a storm rolling in over the horizon. Because Emily had never known what it felt like to have something she loved ripped away from her. But she was about to learn. The moment Emily found out the truth, I knew it would be glorious. I didn't hear it directly from her, of course. No, she wouldn't give me the satisfaction of calling me first. Instead, I heard it from a cousin, one of the many relatives who had been watching this entire saga unfold like it was a reality show too good to miss. The message came in while I was sitting at my desk, sipping coffee, scrolling through the endless chain of panicked emails my parents had been sending me all morning. Megan, you will not believe what just happened. I smirked as I read the words, already knowing exactly what they were about. Already picturing the moment Emily had received the legal notice informing her that she no longer owned the house she had been parading around like a trophy. I could imagine the way her face had twisted in confusion, the way her entitled little world had started to crumble the second she had realized that the one thing she had always taken for granted was gone. I took my time before replying, stretching my legs out in front of me, letting the moment breathe, letting the weight of it settle over me like the sweet taste of revenge finally reaching its peak. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I picked up my phone and typed back the only thing that needed to be said. "Oh, I believe it." The full explosion came less than an hour later, my phone vibrating violently against my desk as Emily's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering, letting her simmer in her own rage before I gave her the chance to unleash it. "What the hell did you do?" Her voice was shrill, panicked, so unlike the perfect, sweet, soft-spoken Emily my parents had spent their entire lives protecting. She sounded desperate, and God, how I loved it. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch, letting her squirm before I finally spoke. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my tone light, almost bored, like none of this was a big deal to me. Like her entire world wasn't crashing down around her. "You stole my house," she screeched, her voice cracking at the edges, and I could picture it. Her pacing in her now temporary home, her face red with rage, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned against her. "Correction," I said, tapping my fingers lazily against my desk. "I bought the house. You were just too spoiled to notice that it was never really yours to begin with." There was silence on the other end, a silence so thick and heavy I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to find a way out, trying to grasp at some excuse, some shred of reality where she was still the victim in all of this. "You can't do this to me, Megan," she whispered, her voice shaking now, the first hint of real fear creeping into her tone. "You don't understand, I have nowhere else to go. Mom and Dad." I cut her off before she could finish, my smile widening as I delivered the final blow. "Mom and Dad are broke, Emily. They can't save you this time." And just like that, the world finally stopped spinning in her favor. The news spread fast, my parents scrambling to fix what couldn't be fixed, drowning in debt, legal battles, and the sheer weight of their own failures. They had spent their lives building a world where Emily was untouchable, where she never had to suffer, never had to struggle, never had to fight for anything the way I had. But in doing so, they had left her weak, unprepared for a world that wasn't handed to her on a silver platter. And now, when she finally needed them, when she was finally feeling what I had felt for years, they had nothing left to give. Took less than 2 weeks before they showed up at my door. I saw them through the peephole first, my mother clutching her designer purse like it was a lifeline, my father standing stiff and defeated beside her, Emily just a few steps behind, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes swollen from crying, her entire body radiating resentment. Waited. I let them knock twice before I finally opened the door, leaning casually against the frame as I took them all in, letting them see just how much I wasn't suffering. "We need to talk," my mother said, her voice raw but still carrying that same entitled authority, like she still thought she could demand things from me. I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head slightly. "Oh, about what?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the straps of her bag. We made mistakes, Megan. But this has gone too far. We're family, sweetheart. We have to help each other." I laughed, shaking my head, the audacity of her words hitting me like a slap. Now we were family. Now, when they had nothing left, when they had finally been brought down to their knees, when they had exhausted every other option, now I was supposed to care. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the table behind me. "I actually have something for you," I said smoothly, walking back into the apartment, knowing they would follow, knowing curiosity would outweigh their pride. They sat hesitantly, Emily shifting uncomfortably, my father clearing his throat, my mother watching me with cautious hope, probably expecting some grand gesture of reconciliation. I reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table toward them. My mother hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers shaking as she carefully peeled it open, her face hopeful, expecting some kind of check, some sign that I was finally coming around. But as she unfolded the paper, her expression changed. Her breath caught, her face drained of color, and then she read the words out loud, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Outstanding balance for all unpaid debts, emotional and financial." My father's hands clenched into fists. Emily let out a strangled gasp, her eyes darting between me and the paper as she tried to understand what was happening. "You owe me," I said, my voice low, deliberate, final. "Just like I owed you my whole life." The house was nearly empty now, its rooms stripped of the carefully curated furniture my parents had once prided themselves on, the expensive rugs and overpriced paintings that had once been symbols of their perfect little world, now reduced to meaningless objects shoved into cardboard boxes. The living room, once filled with forced laughter and hollow conversations, felt different without the staged warmth they had always pretended to have, without the illusion that everything in their lives had been carefully controlled. For the first time I saw the house for what it truly was. A shell, a structure built on lies, a place where love had been selective, where generosity had been a privilege reserved for Emily and never for me. I stood in the doorway, watching them pack, their movements slow and mechanical, the weight of their loss finally settling into their bones. My mother, once so poised, once so effortlessly in control of every conversation, now looked older than I had ever seen her, her shoulders slumped, her fingers shaking as she tried to zip up a suitcase that was filled with more regrets than clothing. My father, always the silent one, always the man who pretended that fairness was something he could define, sat on the edge of the stripped-down couch, his hands resting against his knees, his eyes staring at the floor like he was waiting for something, though even he probably didn't know what. Emily was the only one who still had fight left in her, though it was clear even she knew she had lost. She sat against the wall, her arms crossed over her chest, her face flushed with resentment, her eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, as though she still couldn't fully process how this had happened to her, how she had gone from being the sister who had everything to the sister who had nothing at all. I knew what she was thinking, could read it in the way her jaw clenched every time she looked at me, in the way her fingers dug into her arms, in the way she refused to blink for too long, as if closing her eyes would make this all real in a way she wasn't ready to accept. She was thinking about how unfair this was, how it wasn't supposed to happen this way, how she had spent her entire life being chosen while I had been cast aside, and yet somehow in the end she was the one packing her things, she was the one being pushed out, she was the one learning what it felt like to be powerless. "Is this what you wanted?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse, her anger barely restrained beneath the weight of her own humiliation. "To see us like this? To watch them suffer? To make me?" She cut herself off, shaking her head, her throat working as she swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions from spilling out. "You win, Megan. Okay. You win. I hope it was worth it. I should have felt something then. Victory. Satisfaction. The sense of justice I had spent my entire life craving. And yet, as I looked at her, at my parents, at the hollowed-out remains of the life they had built, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt nothing at all. It wasn't that I regretted what I had done, because I didn't. It wasn't that I wished I could take it back, because I wouldn't. But the truth was, for all their lies, for all their favoritism, for all the years of neglect and cruelty, taking everything from them hadn't changed anything about my past. It hadn't rewritten the years I had spent watching from the sidelines, waiting for them to notice me, waiting for them to care. It hadn't erased the loneliness, the rejection, the nights I had spent wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't good enough, why Emily had been given everything while I had been left with scraps. I had taken everything from them. And still the past remained unchanged. My mother looked up at me then, her eyes glistening, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Megan," she said, her tone softer than I had ever heard it, as if, for the first time in her life, she truly saw me. "Please." Single word. "Please. Surrender." I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening at my sides, my heart pounding hard against my ribs as I felt the weight of choice settle over me, heavier than anything I had ever carried before. Could walk away. I could leave them like this, broken, homeless, destroyed, the way they had left me when I had needed them most. I could let them feel the sting of abandonment, let them experience the kind of emptiness they had forced me to endure my entire life. I could let Emily rot in the consequences of the life she had always assumed would be effortless, let my parents struggle in the wreckage of the lies they had built, let them all suffer beneath the weight of everything they had ignored for years. Or I could stop. I could give them one last chance, not because they deserved it, not because they had earned it, but because I needed to know, if given the opportunity, would they finally choose me. For the first time in my life, the power was mine. I stepped forward, reaching into my coat pocket, feeling the weight of the final decision sitting against my palm, cold and solid, the last piece of the game I had played so perfectly. And then, the screen fades to black. The house stands empty. The door closes. The last thing we see is me, standing outside, staring at the place where everything began, the place where everything ended, the place where every unanswered question still lingers in the air, waiting for an answer that may never come. My voice, calm and steady, cuts through the silence, carrying the only words that matter now. "What would you do?"